On a quiet morning in the colony world of Arden, the streets were not as peaceful as they seemed. The sky was filled with smoke from distant fires, and the sound of distant gunfire rolled over the hills. People were running, carrying what little they could. Among them was a young girl named Ilara Wynn, no more than 13 years old, eyes wide with fear as she searched for a way out. Her family had been separated during the attack. Buildings were collapsing, and the roads were blocked by debris. She coughed as the smoke stung her throat, clutching a small satchel to her chest. The sound of shouting and boots pounding the ground made her heart race. She turned down a narrow street, only to find herself face to face with soldiers from the invading faction. They shouted at her, but she could not understand their words. She froze in place. Then, from the side, a figure burst into the alley. It was a human soldier, his uniform torn and dusty, his rifle held ready. His name was Luke Mercer. He had been ordered to fall back to the defensive line, but when he saw the girl in danger, he ignored the command. Without hesitation, he stepped between her and the enemy, firing short bursts to push them back. His voice was calm, but firm. "Stay behind me," he told her. Ilara's legs felt weak, but she did as he said. Luke crouched low, scanning the area. More enemy soldiers were moving in from another street. He knew they would be surrounded soon if they stayed. He reached for Ilara's hand and pulled her along, moving quickly through the narrow alleys. Each step was a blur of smoke, gunfire, and shouts. She could barely keep up, but he never let go of her. They reached a wall of rubble blocking their path. Luke looked around quickly, spotting a half-broken door leading into a warehouse. He kicked it open and guided her inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was covered in debris. He crouched behind a stack of crates as footsteps passed outside. Ilara could hear her own breathing, fast and shaky. "What's your name?" Luke asked quietly. "Ilara," she whispered. "I'm Luke," he said, giving her a quick, reassuring nod. "We'll get you out of here." They waited until the footsteps faded. Then Luke led her out the back, keeping close to the walls. The streets ahead were clearer now, but the sounds of battle were still close. A transport vehicle was waiting near the edge of the settlement, loaded with civilians. Luke waved to the driver and lifted Ilara into the back. Before she could say anything, he stepped away, turning back toward the fight. "Wait," she called out, her voice breaking. "You're not coming with us?" Luke shook his head. "I have to go back. There are more people who need help." Ilara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small for what he had done. As the transport pulled away, she kept her eyes on him until he disappeared into the smoke. That was the last time she saw him. In the years that followed, Ilara often thought about the soldier who had saved her. She remembered the steady look in his eyes, the way he had risked his life without asking for anything in return. She carried that memory with her, not knowing that one day, their paths would cross again in a way neither of them could have imagined. Years passed since the day Luke Mercer saved Ilara Wynn on the streets of Arden. The fires of war had faded, but the memories never left her. She grew into a strong young woman, her mind sharper than most, and her heart full of determination. The colony world where she lived had changed. Leaders rose and fell, and a time of unrest shook the region once again. Ilara's life took a path she could never have imagined. After the sudden loss of the ruling family in a political crisis, the people chose her to lead. She had no royal blood, but her bravery during the dark years and her sense of justice earned their trust. She became queen of the Border Kingdom, a place that stood far from the safer core worlds. The crown was heavy, but she wore it with dignity. As Queen, Ilara spent her days meeting with advisors, strengthening defenses, and making sure her people had food and safety. She knew the peace they enjoyed was fragile. Whispers of an old enemy's return spread through the trade routes. Small outposts went silent. Merchants spoke of ships being attacked in deep space. She had seen war before, and she knew how quickly it could come back. Far away, Luke Mercer had left the army. Years of fighting had taken their toll. He lived quietly in a small settlement near the mountains, repairing machines and tending a modest garden. Though he tried to forget the war, the faces of people he had saved or lost still came to him in dreams. He never knew what became of the young girl from Arden. He only hoped she had found safety. One winter morning, a messenger ship from the capital arrived in Luke's settlement. An old comrade, Captain Rourke, stepped off the ramp with a familiar, steady gaze. "The Queen is calling for military advisors," Rourke said. "She needs people who have seen battle, people who understand what's coming." "I told her about you." Luke shook his head at first. "I'm not a soldier anymore." "You may not wear the uniform," Rourke replied. "But you're still the same man who carried civilians out of burning streets. She needs that man." Reluctantly, Luke agreed to travel to the capital. The journey took 2 days by shuttle. When he arrived, the city amazed him. Tall stone towers lined the streets, and flags bearing the kingdom's crest waved in the cold wind. Guards in polished armor stood watch at every corner. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was tense. Nobles and diplomats argued in the halls about the threat at the borders. Luke was brought to a grand chamber where the Queen was meeting with her council. She stood at the head of a long table, her presence commanding but calm. When she turned to look at him, her eyes lit up with a flash of recognition. Luke felt a strange pause in the room, as if time slowed for a moment. He could not place her face, but something about her gaze stirred a memory deep inside. "Captain Mercer," she said with a soft smile, "welcome to the capital. I have been hoping to meet you." He gave a small nod. "Your Majesty, I will help however I can." For the rest of the meeting, she listened to her advisors, but every now and then her eyes drifted to him. When the council was dismissed, she asked him to remain. The hall grew quiet as the doors closed. "Do you remember the colony of Arden?" she asked. Luke nodded slowly. "I remember many things from Arden, too many." She stepped closer, her voice steady. "You saved a girl there. She was lost in the streets during the siege. You carried her through the fire." He looked at her carefully. Then the memory returned with full force. The smoke, the narrow alleys, the small hand gripping his. His eyes widened. "Ilara," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, "and now I am queen. And once again my people are in danger. Will you stand with me?" Luke did not hesitate. "Yes, always." The days after their reunion passed quickly. Luke settled into his role as a military advisor, spending hours studying maps, reviewing patrol reports, and inspecting the city's defenses. Ilara often joined him in the war room, listening closely to his thoughts. The walls of the palace were thick, but both of them knew that danger could break through if they were not ready. Outside the capital, small villages began reporting strange attacks. Traders arrived with stories of heavily armed raiders striking without warning. The palace guards increased their patrols, but the threat grew bolder. Luke warned that the enemy was testing their defenses before a larger assault. Ilara trusted his judgment completely. One evening, the Queen invited Luke to walk with her through the palace gardens. The air was cool, and the moonlight shone across the marble paths. The sound of water from the fountains mixed with the quiet rustle of leaves. For a while, they spoke of ordinary things. The harvest in the countryside, the rebuilding of roads, the laughter of children in the market. Then Ilara's voice grew softer. "When you saved me all those years ago, I thought I would never see you again. I was just a frightened girl, and you were already a hero in my eyes. You never asked for thanks, but I carried that moment with me. It gave me strength." Luke looked at her for a long moment. "I never saw myself as a hero. I just did what had to be done, but knowing it mattered to you, it means something." Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden arrival of a palace guard. He bowed quickly. "Your Majesty, we have urgent news. Scouts report enemy forces moving toward the outer gates. They could arrive within hours." Ilara's expression hardened. "Sound the alarm. Prepare the city for defense." Luke stepped forward. "I'll take command of the gate defenses. We need to slow them before they reach the palace." As the warning bells rang through the city, the streets came alive with movement. Soldiers rushed to their posts. Merchants pulled their carts from the roads, and families hurried into shelters. The air was thick with tension. At the western gate, Luke organized the troops with precision. He positioned archers on the walls, placed shield bearers in the front lines, and ordered the placement of barricades along the approach road. Every move was calculated to delay the enemy's advance. Ilara arrived at the gate herself, wearing light armor over her royal garments. She stood beside the soldiers, her presence a clear sign that she would not hide behind palace walls. Seeing her there gave the defenders a surge of courage. When the enemy finally appeared on the horizon, they moved quickly, their weapons glinting in the torchlight. The sound of their march echoed against the stone walls. Luke raised his hand, and the archers readied their bows. "Hold," he commanded. The enemy drew closer. Now, a volley of arrows filled the air, striking the front lines. The battle began in full. The clash of steel and the shouts of warriors filled the night. Luke moved among the defenders, shouting orders, steadying those who faltered. Lara fought alongside them, her sword swift and sure. Despite their preparation, the enemy pressed hard. They used siege weapons to batter the gates, and flames began to climb the wooden supports. Luke ordered a counterattack, leading a group of soldiers through a side passage to strike the attackers from the flank. The sudden move broke the enemy's momentum, buying precious time. The surviving raiders began to retreat. The defenders cheered, but the victory felt thin. Many were wounded, and the outer gate was badly damaged. The enemy had been driven off, but Luke knew they would return in greater force. When the fighting was over, Ilara approached him. Her armor was scorched, her hair tangled, but her eyes were steady. "You were right," she said. "This was only the beginning." Luke nodded. "We have to be ready for what comes next. They will not give up easily." She looked out over the city, where smoke still rose in the pale light. "Then we will stand together, as we did today, and we will not fall." The weeks after the attack were filled with constant work. The outer gate was rebuilt with stronger materials, and the damaged parts of the wall were reinforced. Patrols doubled. Watchtowers were manned day and night, and messages were sent to nearby towns to be ready for trouble. Yet despite their efforts, Luke and Ilara both felt the pressure of the coming storm. Reports from scouts confirmed their fears. The enemy was gathering a much larger force, with siege engines and heavy infantry. They had not been defeated, they had only been delayed. Luke knew that this battle would decide the fate of the kingdom. One night, as rain poured over the city, Luke stood in the war room, studying the maps by lamplight. Ilara entered quietly, her steps soft on the stone floor. She looked tired, but her gaze was steady. "You should rest," he said, not looking up from the table. "And you?" she asked. "I will rest when the city is safe." She walked closer, her eyes moving over the battle plans. "The people believe in you," she said. "When they see you on the walls, they know they are not alone." Luke gave a small nod. "They believe in you too. You give them something worth fighting for." At dawn, the enemy arrived. The horizon was dark with their numbers. Their banners rose above the rain, and the thunder of their march shook the ground. The city bells rang out again, calling every defender to their post. On the walls, archers readied their arrows. Shield lines formed at the gates. The air was tense, every sound sharp in the cold morning air. Luke walked along the wall, speaking to the soldiers, steadying their nerves. Lara stood at the main gate, her armor polished, her sword at her side. When the first stones from enemy catapults smashed against the walls, the defenders held their ground. Arrows flew in thick clouds, and the air was filled with the clash of metal. Luke directed the counterfire, using ballistia to strike down the siege engines. Each hit drew cheers from the wall, but the enemy pressed forward. The fighting lasted for hours. Smoke and rain mixed in the air, making it hard to see. At the south wall, part of the stone gave way under the pounding of a ram. Enemy soldiers surged through the breach. Luke grabbed his sword and ran to meet them, rallying the defenders. The fighting there was fierce, and the ground turned slick with mud. Meanwhile, Ilara led a charge at the main gate. She fought with precision, her sword flashing in the dim light. Every time her soldiers began to falter, she pushed forward, shouting for them to stand. Her courage spread through the ranks like fire. As the sun broke through the clouds, the tide began to turn. Luke's counterattack at the south wall pushed the enemy back. At the main gate, Ilara's forces broke their lines, driving them into retreat. Horns sounded across the battlefield, and the enemy began to fall back, leaving their siege weapons behind. When the last of them disappeared over the hills, the defenders stood in silence, listening to the rain on the stones. The city was still standing. They had won. In the courtyard, soldiers embraced, some weeping with relief. Luke found Ilara near the gate, her armor dented, her hair wet from the rain. She looked at him with a tired smile. "We did it," she said. "Yes," he replied. "But it was you who kept them fighting." "No," she said, shaking her head. "We did it together." For a long moment they stood there, the sounds of celebration around them. The battle was over, but both knew that their bond, forged in fire years ago, had grown even stronger in the defense of the kingdom. The battle was over, but the city still carried the marks of the fight. Broken walls, burnt gates, and wounded soldiers were reminders of how close they had come to losing everything. The streets were filled with people helping one another, clearing rubble and tending to the injured. Though the air was heavy with exhaustion, there was also a deep sense of pride. They had stood together in one. Luke walked through the city with slow steps, greeting those he passed. Soldiers saluted him, and children pointed with wide eyes, whispering about the man who had fought at the walls. He never sought praise, but he understood what it meant to them to see him walking among them. It reminded them that even in hard times, heroes could be real. In the palace, Alara met with her advisors to plan the rebuilding. Though she was tired, she did not allow herself to rest yet. Her people needed to see their queen leading them now more than ever. When she heard that Luke had returned from the wall, she sent for him. He entered the great hall quietly, still wearing the same battered armor from the battle. She stood at the far end, sunlight falling across her through the tall windows. "Luke," she said, her voice warm. "Come." He approached, stopping a few steps away. "Your Majesty?" She smiled faintly. "Do you remember the day you saved me on the streets of Arden? I was a frightened girl who thought the world was ending. You carried me through the fire without asking who I was." He nodded slowly. "I remember. That day changed my life," she continued. "You gave me the chance to live, to grow, to lead. Without you, none of this would have been possible." Luke lowered his gaze. "I only did what anyone should do." "Shh. No," she said firmly. "You did what many would not. And now you have done it again. You have saved not only me, but my people." There was a moment of silence. The sounds of the city carried faintly through the open windows. Then Alara stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. "You will always have a place here," she said. "As long as this kingdom stands, you will be remembered." Luke gave a small smile. "Then I will stay for a while. There is still work to do." The days that followed were filled with rebuilding. Luke worked alongside the soldiers and builders, repairing walls and helping train new recruits. Alara continued to lead with strength, visiting the damaged districts and speaking with the people. Together, they oversaw the city's recovery. On the evening the gates were finally restored, the people gathered in the main square for a celebration. Lanterns lit the streets, music played, and children danced. Alara stood on the balcony above the square, addressing the crowd. "We faced darkness together," she said, her voice clear and strong, "and together we pushed it back. This victory belongs to every one of you." She turned slightly toward Luke, who stood beside her, "and it belongs to those who stand when others fall." The crowd cheered, the sound echoing off the stone walls. Luke felt the weight of their gratitude, though he knew he could never put it into words. He only nodded, feeling a quiet sense of peace. As the night went on, music filled the air and the city glowed with light. Luke and Alara stood side by side on the balcony, looking over the people they had fought to protect. The future was still uncertain, but they both knew that whatever came, they would face it together. In that moment, the memory of the girl in the smoke and the soldier in the dust seemed like a lifetime ago. Yet it was that single act of courage that had led to this night, this victory, and the unbreakable bond between them. And in the heart of the capital, under the lantern light, the story of Luke Mercer and Queen Alara Wynne began to live on, not as a tale of war, but as a story of hope.